G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far that you're having a fantastic week. Now, I just want to take a moment at the beginning of the video to thank you all for your lovely, your heartfelt messages that I've received, of course, about the very difficult situation of my family losing our beloved dog. Thank you very much. Now, legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. Of course, we're going to look at the maps. We're going to overlay other maps. We're going to also look at a number of geolocations and see where things are shifting. Of course, we know that currently in Ukraine it is winter, and we have been reporting that winter, of course, comes with challenges but also opportunities. So we'll be looking at some data to see how things have changed. Of course, as always, we have a miscellaneous folder. We'll talk about some recruiting as well. We will look at some weapon systems being brought into the fold. Now, Bez, come here. Come here. Hello, sweetheart. Bez is here with me with your grotty toy. Hey, buddy. I'll be with you in a minute. Bez isn't used to me talking on camera. I don't know if you can see. Bez. Okay, we'll continue. What we need to look at is how Ukraine has become the biggest partner of Just Stop Oil. Of course, night after night after night, we have seen that Ukrainian drones have struck Russian oil depots and Russian refining facilities. So we're going to look at what would be the best or worst case scenario is if these continue to be destroyed. How would that impact the Russian economy overall? But firstly, we will start with some... Buddy, come on. He's under the desk. Firstly, we will start with some good news that Australian Mr. Oscar Jenkins is alive. But this, of course, has left the Australian government with their foot in their mouth. And once again, I can't believe that we, on this small channel, have proceeded with more caution than some officials on this. So let's look over what was reported and what is now being reported around this situation as well, and what further developments we may see. Oh no. He's stuck in my cables. Come on, buddy. Come on. Out we go. Out we go. Come back a little bit. Okay, I've had to plug a few things back in. Apologies. Anyway, this article here came out today. Oscar Jenkins, an Australian man reportedly fighting for Ukraine, is alive. And this is from our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. Of course, this comes after the Australian media reported that he was captured, tortured, and killed. That Mr. Oscar Jenkins is alive and is being held as a prisoner of war. That they had received confirmation from Russia that he is alive and in custody, although they still hold serious concerns for Mr. Jenkins. And they have then made it clear to Russia that Russia is obligated to treat him in accordance with international humanitarian law, including humane treatment. Now, whether you believe Mr. Jenkins is a contracted foreign fighter or that he is a mercenary, it doesn't matter. Everyone is still covered under international humanitarian laws. But one thing I want to say in this is we always need to take precaution until you can confirm this. But Mr. Simon Boykov, also known as Aussie Cossack, he has offered from day one when we saw this initial video of Mr. Jenkins who had been captured, he has offered to be swapped with Mr. Jenkins. So I am happy to facilitate this in any way possible. I don't know how, but if there's anything I can do to make this happen, I'm happy to do it, even if that includes doing a round trip there, pick up Mr. Boykov from the Russian consulate, fly him there, do a handover, takeover, and come back with Mr. Jenkins to get an Australian home. I'm happy to facilitate that in any way possible. Please let me know. But of course, we saw on January 15th articles like this. The Sydney Morning Herald has revealed Australian Oscar Jenkins, who was taken captive by Russian forces in the Donbass region of Ukraine last month, was tortured for days before he was killed. Herald reported that a sergeant known as Gump confirmed the Australian's death and called him a hero. Gump told the masthead Jenkins had been executed and that his body had been recovered. The confirmation came after Ukrainian forces told 7 News the body of the former private school teacher had been found 3 weeks ago. So confirmation from the Ukrainian forces to then Australian media that he had been killed. But now, in a turn of events, this, and the credibility is, of course, being brought into question. And we have always said that things here just didn't add up. It would make no sense for Russia to then execute him afterwards, giving the value of this prisoner being a foreigner. But then on the other hand, we said, well, why would he have been kept at the front for a number of weeks and then killed if the Russians had to make tactical movements out? We did say that it just never seemed to really add up, that there was probably a lot more in this story. But what we will say is the narrative about this has already done its job. The positive news won't spread like the bad news has done, and the damage here is already done. Now, you will remember I shared this message with you from a contact, that Aussie Oscar Jenkins was a good friend of mine. 2 days ago, the brigade received his body and was identified. Single shot to the head. He was, in fact, executed. I just thought you might want to know from someone on the ground around him. I'd rather leave out my call sign, as this is still an internal matter as of the moment. No official releases I've heard of for some reason or another. The fella set out his flag on Maidan. I showed you that image. You can share that photo if you would like. And this was my reply at the time. Thank you for your message and kind words. I'm sorry for your loss. Oscar sounds like a great guy. I hope you understand I have to urge on the side of caution in my reporting until beyond reasonable doubt. We both know how the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Ruskies can make shit up, especially news.com. And then we showed you those screenshots below. So, in fact, in here it seems that Mr. Jenkins is alive, and there is a lot of credibility being brought into question around this. Will people care en masse? Probably not, to do with the massive informational war that is happening. But let's hope that Mr. Jenkins can return home in the near future. And again, if there's anything I can do to help facilitate this, I'm happy to do so. So, legends, let's have a look at the maps. Of course, we have Ukraine in the century screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, of course, on Thursdays, it is Deep State's day off, that they do not update the map. But never fear, we have a lot of other bits and pieces to show you. So let's come down into the east, or the southeastern corner. And of course, we have the Kursk front. Now, there is a lot of reporting saying that this map is well out of date, that we do believe the Russians are right up to Andriivka. There's also a lot of reports that the Russians may be all the way up to Ulaki. As we know, don't let the tips touch. Again, another large pocket has formed. But let's have a look at Dashny right here. Of course, we saw some advances to the north and south of here over the recent days and weeks. Now we have some geolocated footage showing the Russians are, in fact, in the center of Dashny. So at this geolocation right here. So we're looking for, there's a red roof in here, just to the east of here, right where my cursor is at the moment, we have this footage. Now, I won't show you all of the footage here, but there is an attack on this building here, first with artillery, and then we see Russian forces moving on to these positions. This is being confirmed by Ukrainian Noel Reports' map as well as then DivGen map for this southern movement. So we can confirm Dashny, some positions in the south are coming under Russian occupation. Let's remain in this area and have a look at some other bits and pieces. So just to the north of here, we have this Nadez front, Srebeni front that we have spoken about, that DivGen has been updating. So let's have a look at this. And what we're looking for is this reservoir. So just to the west of here, that some of these areas are coming under Russian occupation. Again, this is DivGen map. Wait to see if other maps do confirm this. We'll stay around Pokrovsk, as we know this sector, Russia is trying to secure the flanks, cut it off, not only then cut off the flanks and the ability to provide logistics, but eventually want to gain Pokrovsk, but also looking to come through Dashny, the last stronghold, before they will enter Dnipro Oblast. Now, what we see inside of Pokrovsk, I'll show you the geolocation first, but just on the southern edge, right in some of these larger high-rise buildings here, we see that a number of radio repeaters are being taken out. Now, these repeaters, they can, of course, repeat radio signals. So not only for communications, but also for drones too. And this is footage of Russian drones striking a number of these radio repeaters. Of course, a very important asset in a war like this. Let's move our way up into Chasiv Yar. Of course, we have Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, an area which you will be very, very familiar with. I showed you a geolocation yesterday of Russian infantry right around where my cursor is at the moment, and DivGen map has updated to show this advancement. Deep State hasn't updated today and didn't show that update yesterday. Let's move Seversk front. Now we have more geolocations to show you. So I'll show you the geolocation first. At this town, just before this turns up to the north, we see this footage that there is a Russian armoured assault that does then drop off troops into this destroyed area, clearing a number of positions. At this point, I cannot confirm if the Russians have been able to hold this area, but we know right out into here is definitely grey zone, with an attack penetrating some 2.8 kilometers. So the updates around Velyka Novosilka are very important, both tactically, strategically, and I think we've seen a lot of the informational war come to bear from this, due to just the amount of channels completely ignoring the horrible situation that happened in Velyka Novosilka. Again, use this as a barometer for those who care about what is happening versus those who care about a narrative. And it's been very, very disappointing to see some channels who put themselves as unbiased or just reporting on the war as they see it, not talking at all about Velyka Novosilka, a major area coming under control, and the 1/10th being left here again to die. Of course, after they were left in Avdiivka. So why is this so important? Well, one, it is a major area that has come under control, and an area which Ukraine at the moment, with an acute manpower shortage, can't afford to lose. But also, they've returned all of the 2023 gains for the Ukrainian counteroffensive on this front. But also, when we look at the fortifications, you might get a better idea. Now, this is from Mr. John Helen, J_J Helen on Twitter. We have Velyka, Novosilka, Novaya Komar, and where the Russians are. Of course, where the Russians will want to get to is Komar. So let's zoom in on Komar and show you why this is important. So the Russians will want to follow the Nokry Yali up and try and move as best they can around some of these fortified lines. Once and if they can get to Komar, of course, there are large intersections, interchanges here. Of course, this will affect Ukraine's ability to supply further east, or increase Russia's ability to supply into the west, and further movements to gain the remainder of Donetsk Oblast. So we will see, but this is a very, very important area, and Velyka Novosilka was a major stronghold here. If we zoom out on the map, you get a slightly better idea of where Velyka Novosilka is, the number of fortified lines that have come under control, and the remaining fortified positions before, well, it turns into a lot more open territory into the Donbass, into Dnipro Oblast. So, of course, this is a very, very important area, and a lot of soldiers were lost here and fought here very bravely as well. And it is sad to see how this is just completely bloody ignored if it doesn't fit the narrative of everything is going fantastically. We'll see how that narrative holds up long term. So, of course, we've spoken about winter and how winter brings in a number of challenges and, of course, opportunities. Now, one of the main ones we've spoken about is, of course, kilometre squares and FABs mixed with artillery, and what changes we may see here. Now, this gentleman here, this Vitaly, and this is his @ on Twitter, has spoken about FAB usage. Bomb usage has almost fully recovered, averaging more than 75 FABs per day, with spikes exceeding 100. But this is a very interesting graph to look at on his data, that we see through December into early January that there was definitely a reduction in these glide bombs, of course, with the large increases towards the end of last year. Now, this is for a number of reasons, and if we go back, we can actually see fighter bombers speaking about these particular reasons that Ukrainian channels are talking about. There's a lot less FABs of these glide bombs flying towards them. It goes from not much less to shockingly less. He says there is some truth in this. The weather is far from winter-like. Fog and heavy icing in the clouds severely affect both aircraft and guided bombs. Because of this, we can't bomb as freely as we do in summer, but whenever there's a weather window, we drop a lot at once to compensate for what we missed. So we are not surprised to see This because the weather is not super winter-like, so it's not really frozen, but just really poor conditions. But he also speaks on some policy and command problems causing this too. There's a bar graph showing the number of bombs dropped on enemy positions, and that's the graph the bosses pay attention to. The bombs are dropped solely to meet quota set by the bosses. As a result, they're being dropped on outdated, irrelevant targets, where the enemy wasn't just an hour ago, but maybe, perhaps, possibly 2 days ago, but that's not certain. Of course, some of the bombs hit actual relevant targets, but under this quota-driven system, most efforts go into making pretty bar graphs rather than effectively hitting targets. Quota-driven systems not working? At least the Russian Air Force is very similar to a hell of a lot of businesses. Further, he speaks of how to reduce the delay between target acquisition and striking is unclear, especially since bombers are currently using the slowest possible method of combat operations. Add to this the weather and equipment failures. So we are not surprised at all to see that lull in the amount of FABs being dropped. Fighter bomber here speaking about some of the challenges the Russian Air Force faces getting those bombs on target. But don't underestimate the adaptability, although maybe slow, to improve some of this policy. The best example of this is with the Iskanders. We saw that kill chain from target acquisition to hitting the target. We saw that improve dramatically. Of course, fighter aircraft come with a whole bunch of other problems. So let's continue on what Vitaly has shown. Territorial gains in December is averaging about 10 kilometres per squared per day, 30% less than the previous month. However, there is a gradual recovery with gains rising from 7 kilometres at the beginning of the month to 13 kilometres squared. We can see this as well, and these graphs go right in line, of course, with FABs. Of course, correlation and causation don't exactly go into line, but we can see whether all of these different factors included, it does go with what we spoke about, that we'd likely see increased then destruction, but decreased amount of kilometre squares over winter. He says artillery barrages have increased by 15%, reaching 5,000 per day. However, the number of shells used remains unknown, leaving the nature of this change unclear. Meanwhile, MLRS activity has decreased by over 25% in recent weeks. One thing this doesn't show, if you were to draw down more on these numbers, is I do think the use of thermobarics has increased dramatically over the past weeks. What does Vitaly make of this? Someone says, is this preliminary indicator of exhaustion in 1 to 2 months? As many will say that this is, but have been saying for months. He says this is an indicator of regrouping. Kramatorsk will be the next big target after Pokrovsk, and they should start working on the offensive setup. We spoke back in October about the weather slowing some things down. Russia actually slowed down, at least in kilometre squares, a lot less than I thought they would. The payoff in decreased movement, though, is increased destruction. Although there may be less FABs, we've seen more artillery, but then targets won't be moving as quickly on the front line. Due to these conditions, you may see an increase in destruction as well. I've been seeing a lot of pages complain recently of the thick mud and the snow, waiting for a big freeze. But a lot of these pages also pointing to the next 10 days, we do see some of the temperatures plummet. Next week, it is going to be well below zero. So this may give opportunity for some more ground movements. So let's have a look in my miscellaneous folder. Now, this video has been circulating, apparently showing in Kherson a new Ukrainian 155 artillery munition called Copperhead, saying that this is laser guided. Now, some are saying that this footage is a guided bomb rather than an artillery shell, but for now, let's just say it is an artillery shell until we have further confirmation. Now, of course, what we have spoken about is the Excalibur. The Excalibur is a guided shell, but of course off GPS and very easily jammed. We've seen Russia have a lot of success with their Krasnopol. Krasnopol, of course, is laser guided. So, just for instance, imagine this is the shell in the air. If you're talking GPS GLONASS guided, it's going all the way to a satellite and back down, can be jammed. You've got a long way to go. What a laser-guided shell is doing is you'll have a drone in the air as well, lasing that target, and it is giving corrections to the artillery shell in the air. And what we can see here is then this shell striking this building here. Now, the reason some are pointing to this is it does seem like a lot of destruction for a 155 shell. I'm not a bombardier. I'm not an artillery expert. So at this point in time, I'll go with what seems to be all the pages saying that it is likely a new laser-guided artillery shell for those 155mm Western systems that have entered Ukraine. Also, all over the channels, I have seen that there is an increase in billboards being put up, advertising being put up to try and get more people to join the Russian armed forces. We see the money here. Now, what a lot of people are saying to this is there's a lot of people now joining because they believe that the war may be ending soon and they don't want to miss out on this very large bonus. And what they're somewhat banking on is possibly during their training time that the war may end. Or if they are set to the front, they're not going to be there for that long, given some of Trump's messaging. So that there is, in turn, an increase in volunteers. At least that's what I'm seeing claimed. Because what we know is this money has never been possible in Russia, and likely it won't be for a long time, if ever. So a lot of people are banking on, I'll sign up, the war will end, and I will claim this money. Could this result in a boost in recruitment? It definitely could. So this, for just your sign-up bonus, is 2.1 million rubles, which translate to just over 21,000 USD, which is a lot of money. But when we put it into the PPP, the purchasing power parity, this is the equivalent to 78,700 USD, because of course things are much cheaper in other areas around the world. Some areas, they claim, are paying up to 4 million rubles for the sign-up bonus. People are even moving because of this. Of course, 4 million is just over 40,000 USD or $150,000 in the purchasing power parity. A shitload of money. Just a side note on this though. Few nations in history have had the sheer potential that Russia possesses and has possessed before to become an incredibly wealthy and prosperous country. It boasts vast natural resources, a large and historically resilient population, has access to major seas, extensive land borders, and a deep cultural and political legacy. Yet, time and time again, internal policy, miscalculations of foreign policy, war, issues with things like alcoholism has squandered Russia's potential again and again. And this has prevented Russia from reaching its full potential and strengthened its position on the world stage time after time after time. So let's talk about the war on resources and oil, trying to undercut Russia's ability to continue financing the war. And overnight again, there has been more strikes against Russian oil facilities, with this one in Novgorod on an oil refinery. Now, one thing I always say with these is we need to wait for a lot of satellite imagery just to see the actual amount of damage on this. And this was shared from the UK MOD on one of their intelligence updates. And what we can see here is that 4 tanks have been destroyed, 10 have been damaged. And this is why I say when dealing with a highly flammable substance, wait for photographs after or satellite images, because the initial fireball will make it look far more devastating than it actually is when we are to assess the damage. Of course, you see images of this with it burning and pluming black smoke everywhere. Yeah, the whole thing must be gone. But if we want to actually assess the damage, we have to wait for pieces like this. So in this, we see that 4 are then destroyed, 10 more damaged. Again, probably 4 that have actually lost their amount of oil that they were holding. So I conducted a bit of an experiment today using both DeepSeek AI and ChatGPT. And I thought I'd ask the both just to see where the answers came out. And I think this is interesting as well when we talk about economic collapse within Russia. Okay, I asked, if every Russian oil depot and refinery within 1,000 kilometers of Ukraine was suddenly stopped operating, what percentage and amount of GDP would that have on Russia's overall economy? So this is the question I asked. We're going to sort of skip through this because it gives a lot of background information. One thing we do need to talk about, and we have spoken about before, is short-term impact of this, because of course fuel shortages but less on the market supply demand can cause price spikes, which can buffer this and increase cash flow as well. But we can see some of the monetary impact that DeepSeek is saying that this would have, as well as the geopolitical and market reactions. Such a shutdown would likely cause global oil prices to spike, benefiting Russia in the short term. Of course, this spike that we have spoken about, if it could still export crude oil, supply and demand. However, the inability to refine oil domestically would hurt its economy more than the potential gains from a higher price. Conclusion. A sudden shutdown of oil depots and refineries within 1,000 kilometres of Ukraine could reduce Russia's GDP by 2 to 10%, translate to a loss of $36 to $180 billion annually. Of course, large range, but a hell of a lot of money. Now, I wanted it to narrow this down a little bit more. So I did its like deep think thing, trying to be more factual, actually assess the information here. Now, it gives the affected refineries and their capacities. And at the bottom here, GDP impact. And this narrows it down. The direct hit to refining would be 3 to 4% of GDP. Could reduce GDP by 1.5 to 2% initially, with then flow-on effects after could add another 1 to 3%, totaling 2.5 to 5% GDP loss. Remember, this is all of the refineries, all of the depots, everything taken out. We need to look at some of the secondary effects from this too. Of course, we could have large fuel inflation. The prices could surge 30 to 50%. This would, of course, impact agriculture, logistics, manufacturing. Crude exports, Russia could redirect crude oil, not refined products, to China and India. Now, of course, this may then buffer some of this because initially prices may rise, offsetting some of that, but that is more short-term. Long-term, permanent damage. If the facilities are destroyed, not just idled, rebuilding them could take 3 to 5 years and a cost of $10 to $20 billion. Now, we're not going to see all these then completely destroyed with what we are seeing at the moment. More about that short-term cutting off the oil. But still, that is needed to be taken into account. We have then the monetary estimates here, key uncertainties, the duration of the shutdown, and how much this could actually impact things if it's just short-term or long-term. And of course, global prices play a large role, and if these were shut down or destroyed, of course, we see that price could inflate. Conclusion. A sudden shutdown of refineries and depots within 1,000 kilometres of Ukraine would likely reduce Russia's GDP by 2.5 to 5%, 47 to 95 billion annually, with refining losses, inflation, and export disruptions driving the decline. This aligns with the economic blow from sanctions in 22 of 2.1% GDP, but would be more severe if prolonged. So this is basically saying it would be very similar to those sanctions we saw. It will have an effect, but may not have the catastrophic effect some are thinking. So let's break this down further. And then I wanted to have another source. So I asked ChatGPT, if every Russian oil depot and refinery within 1,000 Ks, what would happen? Oil infrastructure within 1,000 Ks. It gives the amount that these then produce. Also, the GDP impact of what it may have. Direct hit, 4 to 5% of Russia's total GDP. Conclusion. Would reduce Russia's GDP by 5 to 7%, 75 to 105 billion. Realistically, these are very similar numbers. While significant, it would not be an economic collapse, as Russia could shift some refining to eastern regions and adapt through alternative supply chains. Remember, they'd still be able to adapt to changes here as well. Now, I then asked DeepSeek, how do you think this would affect Russia's ability to continue to wage war in Ukraine? They spoke about fuel shortages. Of course, you need a lot of fuel to wage war. The amount of money coming out of the federal budget, and saying also that there could be domestic chaos, that these large disruptions to the economy, further rising inflation, this could, of course, have a lot of public unrest, and Putin have to divert resources away from the war. Outcome. Russia's war machine would slow within months. Fuel rationing, fewer artillery shells, and logistical breakdowns would follow. If prolonged, Ukraine could exploit these weaknesses to regain momentum. There's more in this. I asked ChatGPT the same thing. They're saying a 5 to 7% GDP loss. This would strain Russia's war effort, but not stop it. Overall, it would weaken Russia's war effort, but not end it, unless combined with other major economic and military pressures. So my takeaway from this is we're seeing Ukraine put all its resources at the moment, or a shitload of it, into drone strikes, and they can't just have strategic successes like this without still focusing on having tactical successes and small strategic successes on the front line too. You can't just ignore issues at the front and rely on taking out oil areas within 1,000 Ks to get the upper hand in this war. It all, of course, can help. Everything is connected, but you can't just lean all your resources into that rather than focus as well on the front line. It needs to be all as once. War is like its own organism. So then I asked, would this collapse the economy? A sudden shutdown of Russian oil infrastructure within 1,000 km of Ukraine would severely damage Russia's economy, but it likely would not cause a full collapse, given the resilient energy sector and its refining capability. 70 to 75% of it is outside of that 1,000-kilometre zone, as well as with allies as well, being able to send crude and then refine it there, especially if we saw an inflate in that price. Economic war footing. This is something that's important. That Russia's economy is already militarized. The state would prioritize fuel and funds for the military, even if civilians suffer shortages. And this is something we forget, is that because this is state-run, that it can prioritize fuel to the tanks and to the military, to their vehicles. Yes, it would impact the civilians massively, but we can't think about the impact it would have on civilians somewhere like Australia and say that it's going to be equal to the impact on then the Russian citizens, who go through far more peaks and troughs around things like this than us, especially historically as well. There is more resilient to economic changes there also. So yes, it would have a problem, but for the actual capability at the front, there's still going to be a lot of fuel available. Central bank stabilization. Russia's central bank has over 600 billion reserves, although half of this are frozen, but it could use the remaining reserves to stabilise the ruble, subsidise fuel, or prop up critical industries. Why it would still be devastating? Hyperinflation risk. A trigger of 30 to 50% inflation for basic goods erode living standards and causing social unrest. This is a lot of what those initial sanctions tried to do to get uprisings against Putin, although it didn't really work. Where I think many analysts went wrong on this is they looked at what would cause an uprise somewhere like Australia rather than somewhere like Russia, and don't take into consideration the difficulties over the 20th century that many of these people faced and the resilience to face far more hardships around the economy or fuel availability or food as well. The bottom line, this scenario would cripple Russia's economy and degrade its war effort. But total collapse, state failure, currency hyperinflation, total industrial shutdown is unlikely unless paired with broader sanctions, regime instability, or prolonged global oil price crash. So potentially, maybe the US has lifted any limits on Ukraine striking a lot of oil facilities, and then will try and draw down that price of oil by then just saturating the market with more oil to have more of an effect. But this in itself, no. I asked this of ChatGPT too. It would not collapse, but it would cause serious strain. Their economy is large, $1.5 trillion, and it's adapted to sanctions and war conditions. Oil production wouldn't fully stop. Russia export crude and refined oil in eastern regions. The government controls the economy and can prioritise key industries, just like we spoke about, other allies buying it. The 5 to 7% GDP loss is significant. It would cause recession-level damage. There would be fuel shortages, and there could be domestic unrest. Conclusion, it would not collapse Russia's economy, but it would be a major economic and logistical setback, forcing adaptation and increasing long-term war costs in that post-war attritional phase. But we can't add Western standards onto the Russian population either. I think that has been one of the major failings to predict what the effect some of these sanctions may have. What we can take out of this is this itself needs to be linked in with other forms of attacks as well, both tactical, strategic, and using sanctions and all of this all as one. But this in itself will not be a collapse of the economy or an overall war winner. Legends, I had to have a number of cuts in this video. Can't speak. Look after yourselves. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.